Off we go across to Harare now, where little headway is expected from Zimbabwe's courts after a Southern African Development Community summit held in Maputo over the weekend, where a decision that nullified President Robert Mugabe's proclamation of July 31st as the date for general elections was taken. Armed with a Constitutional Court judgment that ordered him to hold elections by the 31st of July, President Robert Mugabe sought to upstage last week's SADC summit called to discuss the political environment and a possible election date by scheduling elections himself by presidential decree. ZANU-PF chief negotiator is Patrick Chinamasa.
Our courts are independent. If the court refuses that extension, would then have no choice but to abide by the ruling that we should hold elections by the 31st. We have no guarantee that the court will give the extension, and the summit actually acknowledges that because the courts are independent, so we cannot guarantee the outcome of any application. The summit also appreciates that in the event of the court saying no to an application for extension, we will have to make sure that we abide by the 31st July deadline.
And let's stay with this issue now and talk to the senior project leader for the Southern Africa at the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation, Webster Zambara. Good afternoon to you, sir.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon to your listeners.
Is it possible for Zimbabwe to hold the elections by the 31st, or at least on the 31st of July?
That's an interesting question. Possible? Perhaps it may be possible, but the issue of elections goes beyond just the possibility. It is the issue of having a proper election which is free and fair and which does not have irregularities. And the situation on the ground points to the fact that Zimbabwe is not yet ready for an election in the period up to 31 July.
All right, let's go back a little bit and start at where this whole thing started. There's a government of national unity there, and President Robert Mugabe really doesn't want that to continue. And of course, we saw there was a referendum also that pointed to this government of national unity to come to an end. SADC said, we met this past weekend and saying that President Mugabe, you cannot have the elections by the 31st. We know that President Robert Mugabe has been agitating for the elections to be held soon, and SADC said 2 weeks. 2 weeks, is that enough?
Certainly not enough. If you look at the background of, you took us back to the GNU, the referendum, and SADC's position, you will discover that it's not only President Robert Mugabe who no longer wants this GNU. Even Morgan Tsvangirai and Washman Nue have acknowledged that this arrangement has failed to work. It has served its purpose, but to move the country forward, it is no longer working. But the issue is around the environment in which the election has to take place. And along the way, there have been some issues that have been raised. For example, this SADC summit came out with a communique which touched on 5 critical issues. First, media reform that has not been implemented. Then secondly, the upholding of the rule of law. And thirdly, the role of the Joint Monitoring and Implementation Committee, which is an inter-party committee. Then election date validity of electoral regulations, which is what President Zuma has been pushing forward as a roadmap for a free and fair election, and that follows the SADC guidelines of holding free and fair elections. And then the deployment of SADC observers, in which the 2 MDCs has requested that observers should come in as early as possible. Now, with this proclamation that President Mugabe put forward on Thursday last week, it means we do not have time on the ground to have all these things implemented, or at least seem to be implemented. For example, the ongoing voter registration process. It is supposed to be a 30-day process, but in this election declaration, it cuts that electoral requirement, which makes the election itself already a rigged election in advance, or at least seem to be rigged.
And it would appear that SADC is not putting its money where their mouth is, so to speak, if I twist it around, and excuse the pun, because Zimbabwe needs money, and they look up to SADC to make that money available. They need about $120 million to have these elections, and SADC is not giving direction and clarity as to where the money is going to come from.
I think the issue of money is one area that also leads to SADC, led SADC to allow Zimbabwe to have time for further reforms towards an election in which all parties would feel free to contest. The issue of funding has been quite problematic, and if you look at the wording of the SADC communique, you get a sense that SADC is hopeful that there is a possibility, if Zimbabweans work hand in hand, if they can work together, there is a possibility of an electoral process that will be acceptable. It is different from the other positions that SADC would take. For example, in the same communique, SADC took a position not to recognize an election that would take place in Madagascar, which is not the case like in Zimbabwe. The issue in Zimbabwe is that the possibility is there for at least an electoral process that would be acceptable to the parties. And to SADC particularly, here is a situation where there is a chance of a successfully mediated process that would lead to a substantive government. And I don't think SADC as an institution would like to miss that chance in Zimbabwe.
And of course, I know you've touched on the 5 key critical issues that came out of the summit in Mozambique. But really, again, I want to go back to the 2 weeks extension that the organization had put forward, saying that at least hold elections by mid-August. And Morgan Tsvangirai, the leader of the one faction of the MDC, says 2 weeks is not enough to implement media reforms, to uphold the rule of law, to allow for observers to come in, to also deal with the issues of violence, and so on and so on. So surely it's problematic.
The issue of 2 weeks is too short. And even I would think, even if you put 4 months, the changes that needs to be done at institutional is quite broad. But also consider that in August, from the 24th to the 28th, Zimbabwe is co-hosting with Zambia the World United Nations Tourism Organization Summit, and I don't think the parties in Zimbabwe would like to be holding an election when there is such an important international summit. So those are some of the challenges, and we want to see, particularly when the Minister of Justice goes to the courts today or tomorrow, if the extension is given. Because if it is given, it will make the parties in Zimbabwe consider such events. Because 2 weeks, you are right, 2 weeks is too short for any fundamental change to have happened.
I don't know if you have been monitoring, Mr. Zambara, what's happening at the African Union. The AU appears to be in conflict with SADC over a date for Zimbabwean elections. I mean, the AU says Zimbabweans themselves must resolve a row over President Robert Mugabe's decision to call an election on the 31st of July. What do you make of that?
I don't think it's a contradiction per se. But look at things. On Saturday, the first batch of AU observers arrived in Harare to observe this election. And currently, SADC is also training its monitors for a quick deployment. I think one thing that I read in AU's position is that the issue of the court ruling should not be taken out of the context of the rule of law. Because if that happens, I think a serious precedent would have taken place where a regional institution would override a court's ruling. That is why SADC was very cautious. It said, may you go back and request a change of days, knowing, I think, quite cognizant of the fact that there is a possibility that the court may refuse, but that request on its own, coming from SADC, means a lot, particularly to ZANU-PF and Robert Mugabe, who had declared the dates.
All right, we thank you very much, Mr. Webster Zambara, Senior Project Leader for the Southern Africa at the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation. And it's 26 minutes now past 12 right here on Midday Live on SAfm, South Africa's news and information leader. You will know that